I'm really happy to introduce our speaker. Her name is Paige Desjardins, and Paige is a former student at, not just at Fanshawe College, but in the General Arts and Science program, like many of you are enrolled in. She graduated from our program 4 years ago, and this program really opened her eyes to the world. It made her angry, and she's now harnessed that anger into political activism. Paige does a lot of activism, especially concerning the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And she's been to Gaza once, and over Christmas she tried to go back a second time. They wouldn't let her in, unfortunately. But she will share with you her experiences and observations and invite you to join her in activism. So welcome, Paige. Thank you so much for coming.
Lyra kind of stole my introduction, I was going to say, but that's all right. So I'm Paige, and I'm in my third year at Western, and the reason I'm here to talk to you is, you can tell by the title of my talk that I spent 36 hours in Gaza, and I'm kind of feeling the title is a little misleading now, because when I started to think about today, and I was practicing in front of the mirror, or whatever I was doing to prepare, I thought, it's really hard to understand what happened in Gaza without understanding a lot of stuff that happened before. So I am going to talk about Gaza, but first I'm going to go through a little bit of the history of Israel and Palestine. So I tried to make it as interesting as possible, and if I'm putting anyone to sleep, tell me afterwards, because I have to do this in 2 weeks. So if I'm boring, I won't even be offended, I swear, just let me know. So if I could get the next slide up there. These are some of the things that I feel is important to talk about before I talk about Gaza. There's certain images in the media when you think about Israel and Palestine that are really prevalent. One of them is that the conflict is an ancient feud between Jews and Muslims, which is absolutely not true. That Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, I've heard that a lot of times. That Israel is always fighting against terrorism and defending itself. And that Palestinians always present obstacles to peace. So we have to ask ourselves, why are these the things that we hear in the media a lot of times? And one of the reasons why I think this is because something called news bias. There's an organization that's called Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, and their whole job is to read all kinds of news stories and check for news bias, see if there's things that are being reported, if there's facts that are being left out, if the news coverage is unbalanced. And these are some of the things that they found in the mainstream media when the media was reporting on Israel and Palestine. One was that they failed to mention the international law that applied to the conflict. So they wouldn't mention that indiscriminate attacks on civilian populations are a violation of international law. So what that means is that when you use an attack on a people, you have to use discriminate weapons, so weapons that discriminate between civilians and people who are fighting. And they don't mention that, they never mention this in the coverage when there's some kind of military action by Israel. Another thing that they found was that Palestinians are commonly blamed for Israeli violence, and that Israeli quotes are uncritically, Israeli sources are uncritically quoted. So if you're talking about indiscriminate violence, an Israeli spokesperson would maybe claim that civilians did die, but there were fighters in the area where they died, so they weren't targeting the civilians. And the papers will often quote this, but they won't independently check out to see if that's actually true. And another thing they found was that Palestinian Arab deaths were always underreported, while Israeli deaths received front page coverage. So they felt that the media was making a choice between whose lives were more important. So I think another reason, oh, never mind. You're way ahead of me. Another reason they found that I think there's a lot of silence in the mainstream media and why we're not getting the whole story is because people are afraid to speak out. And not the way I'm kind of afraid right now to be speaking in front of people, but they're afraid of being called anti-Semitic. And that's something that often happens. People who criticize Israel are called anti-Semitic. And there's actually something going on in Canada to try and make this happen. It's called the Canadian Parliamentary Coalition to Combat Anti-Semitism. It's a huge mouthful. And it's a coalition headed by our Immigration Minister, Jason Kenney. And they're basically redefining what anti-Semitism means. And this is a quote from their website. They say, While accusations of blood libel are still being made against the Jewish people, instead they are being directed against the state of Israel, such that anti-Zionism is being used as a cover for anti-Semitism. So this sounds a little bit confusing, and this is admittedly one of the weirdest worded paragraphs I've ever read. But when you start to look at what the terms mean, you start to figure out that this is a very false and misleading claim, because Zionism is a 19th century political movement that aimed at creating a Jewish state. So it's a political movement, and the problem with this political movement is that the territory that was chosen to create a state was Palestine, which was, of course, inhabited by Palestinians. Anti-Semitism is racism against Jewish people simply because they are Jewish. So I would come to the conclusion that criticism of Zionism or Israel is not anti-Semitic, and this is a really important point, because when you're criticizing Israel, you're criticizing a state. When you're criticizing Zionism, you're criticizing a political movement. You're not criticizing someone for being a certain religion or ethnicity. It's a propaganda claim that's used a lot of times to silence people. And one of the important things to keep in mind is that many Jewish people are very, very critical of Israel and Zionism. So these are some of the names. You might have heard of Noam Chomsky or Naomi Klein. She wrote the book No Logo. And there's also the leader of the delegation that I went on to Gaza, Sandra Rush. She is Jewish and in fact lived in Israel for about 5 years. There's also many Jewish human rights organizations that criticize Israeli action in the occupied territories. So, why am I talking about all this stuff that doesn't seem to have a lot to do with Gaza? I felt that it was necessary to kind of tell the narrative that you guys aren't going to hear on CBC or Fox News especially, and that's the Palestinian narrative. So I wanted to put what happened in Gaza into context before I started to speak about it. So the first thing that's important to talk about is who are the Palestinians. So in short, they're the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine. They had a continuous presence there since 638 until when the State of Israel was created in 1948.